Hello, everybody. Welcome to another read along session with me. Today, we're going to start chapter 16, Economic and Social Life and Cultural Developments under the Mughals. Economic and social conditions, standards of living, the masses. So, first, we're going to study the standards of living of the masses. The Mughal Empire reached the zenith of its economic, social, and cultural development during the first half of the 17th century. However, in reviewing the economic and social conditions, we shall review the developments from the advent of Akbar to the middle of the 17th century. Since no basic changes in the economic and social spheres took place during the period, a striking feature of the economic and social situations during the time was the glaring disparity between the highly ostentatious lifestyle of the ruling classes on the one hand and acute poverty and want of the people, the peasants, artisans, and laborers on the other. Scanty clothing was conventional in South India, as we have noticed in an earlier chapter. The climate had a great deal to do with this. However, clothing is necessary for some part of the year in North India. So the climate played a major role in the clothing of the people. So in the South India, as we've seen, there's scorching heat and so much effect of the sun. So we could see that in that time as well, there was scanty clothing and it was a convention, it was a norm in southern India. However, in North India, because of the change of the climate and the altitude also, there was the need of clothing for some time of the year. Babar was struck by the scanty clothes worn by the common people. He observed that peasants and people of low standing go out naked. He then goes on to describe the langota or the uh, decency clout worn by men and the sari worn by the women. His impression has been corroborated by later travelers. Ralph Fitch, who came to India towards the end of the 16th century, says that at Banaras the people go naked, save a little cloud bound about their middle. Writing about the people between Lahore and Agra, Salbanch says, the plebeian is so poor that the greatest part of them go naked. So this describes the poverty and the misery of the masses. Delet wrote that the laborers had insufficient clothing to keep themselves warm and cozy during winter. However, Fitch observed, in the winter which is our May, the men wear quilted gowns of cotton and quilted caps. The remarks of the foreign travelers need to be treated with some caution. Coming from a colder climate and not familiar with the climate and traditions of India, the impression of nakedness which they gained was natural. The overall impression remains one of insufficiency of clothing rather than nakedness. So, these accounts would rather point to the insufficiency of clothing and not the nakedness of the people because they have been coming from a different climatic region and they have had seen different conditions, so they would not get the ideas of clothing of the people living in this very environment because first of all there's heat, and at that time we could only account their observations as something which would point to the insufficiency of the clothing of the people and not mere nakedness. It should be remembered that in those days, though cotton and cotton cloth production was more widely distributed over the countryside than at present, cloth was comparatively more expensive than it is now in terms of food. Okay. Nakedness extended to shoes. Nikitin observed that the people of the Deccan went barefooted. A modern author, Moreland, says that he did not find a shoe mentioned anywhere north of the Narmada River, except Bengal, and ascribes it to the high cost of leather. However, the contemporary English traveller Ralph Fitch, speaking of Patna, says, here the women be so bedecked with silver and copper that it is strange to see. They use no shoes by reason of the rings of silver and copper they wear on their toes. So he's attributed the um, deprivation of shoes as in the women as the wearing of rings of silver and copper on their toes. As far as housing and furniture was concerned, little need be said. The mud houses in which the villagers lived were not different from those at present. They had hardly any furniture except cords and bamboo mats and earthen utensils which were made by the village potter. Copper and bell metal plates and utensils were expensive and were generally not used by the poor. Regarding food, rice, millets, and pulses, what Pulsed and Delayed call khichdi, formed the staple diet, with fish in Bengal and on the coast, and meat in the south of the peninsula. In North India, chapatis made of wheat or coarse grain with pulses and green vegetables were common. The common people, it is said, ate their main meal in the evening and chewed pulses or other parched grain in the day. Ghee and oil were much cheaper relative to food grains then and seem to have been a staple part of the poor man's food. So this is an irony because ghee and oil are considered to be on a higher end in today's world, which was not back then. And also, it has been mentioned as a poor man's food. But the salt and sugar were more expensive. Obviously, salt and sugar were more expensive, and it is said that, like I've read in some articles, that sugar was considered to be the royal food because only the rich could afford it. And that is why you would see that in many occasions, like people say in most of the Hindu festivals, like Meetha Kara or ye sab, and this is because sweet was used in such a occasional experience. And yeah, this while people had less clothes to wear and shoes were costly, unbalanced, they ate better. With more grazing land, they could keep more cattle, so that more milk and more so that more milk and milk products must have been available. So at that time, there was no concept of lactose intolerant. I guess there were people, but it was not really diagnosed, and there was a lot of milk and poultry available. But the position was reversed in the time of famine. It was costly to move grain by land, and there are many references to devastating famines in which parents sold their children, and there are even reports of men eating their own kind. Though the state organized relief kitchens and sometimes nobles and rich people also helped, these were never sufficient. The standard of living ultimately depends upon incomes and wages. So, this is the ultimate truth that the standard of living depends upon income and wages. It is difficult to determine the income of the large mass of the peasants in real terms, for money hardly entered into transaction in the villages. The village artisans were paid for their services by means of commodities which were fixed by custom. It is difficult to compute the average size of the holding of the peasant. The information available to us shows that there was a great deal of inequality in the villages. The peasants who did not have their own plows and bullocks often tilled the lands of the zamindars or the upper caste and could eke out a bare existence. Peasants of this time were called pahis. The 16th century Hindu poet Tulsidas has said that this type of cultivation was a source of misery because they did not have the money or the resources in order to sustain their lifestyle, in order to sustain the bare minimum things they need. So it eventually led them to more misery. Whenever there was a famine and famine were frequent, it was this class of peasants and the village artisans who suffered the most. The peasants who owned the land they tilled are called khud kasht. They paid land revenue as customary rates. Some of them had many plows and bullocks which they let out to their poorer brethren. It has been estimated that the population in India at the beginning of the 17th century was about 125 million. Hence, there was an abundance of cultivable land available, and it may be surmised that peasant proprietors were more numerous than the pahis and the village artisans. All classes of peasants probably had more fuel at their disposal because forests were much more plentiful. Wood and charcoal were supplemented by dropping from the cattle, which were more numerous than now. So the cattle dung. The poorer sections in the village often migrated to towns for employment. This was partly due to the natural growth of population and partly due to their abandoning cultivation due to famine or other unfavorable circumstances such as oversettlement. These people found employment as porters in the army, or as servants, or as unskilled laborers in the town. According to the recent studies, it seems that the productivity of the land was better in the medieval times. With more surplus land available for cultivation, the average size of the holding may also have been larger. In medieval times, the peasant was not dispossessed from his land as long as he paid his land revenue. He would also sell his land. His children inherited his land as a matter of right after his death. Although the state dues were heavy, sometimes amounting to half of his produce, there is no reason to believe that the average peasant was left only with enough to keep body and soul together. Although the life of peasant was hard, he had enough to eat and to meet his simple requirements. Just the bare existence is not the point which they've mentioned over here, that it was not just hand to mouth, it was more than that. The pattern of his life was fixed partly by seasons and partly by custom and tradition in which fairs, pilgrimages, ceremonies, etc. had their due place. As far as cities were concerned, the largest class consisted of the poor, the artisans, the servants and slaves, the soldiers, petty shopkeepers, etc. The salary of the low grade of servant, according to European travels, was less than 2 rupees a month. Just consider what food item would you get at 2 rupees a month at this year, like 2025. I could not think of anything more than confectionery and obviously the PDS food grains available. That's a different case because that has government intervention. But in the general side, in the free market, there's a little scope of what would be available at 2 rupees a month. Anyways, the bulk of the menials and foot soldiers began at less than 3 rupees a month. It has been calculated that a man could feed his family on 2 rupees a month. Okay, so at that time 2 rupees was sustainable amount and people could live with it. So if we would have had the inflation rates and we could compute it from taking 2025 as the base year, we could estimate it around something like 1,000 rupees a month, or it's just an estimate, it's just a guess because we don't have the figures, right? Anyways, Moreland, who wrote in the early part of the 20th century, observed that there was little change in the real wages of workers. They had a more balanced diet, but less to spend on clothes, sugar, etc. Moreland concluded from this that the conditions of the Indian people had not worsened under the British rule. This is his comparison and his conclusion that the conditions of the Indian people had not worsened under the British rule because it was already worse off. How more could they worse? And it's like comparing a situation which is already deteriorating to a much more deteriorated situation, right? It's just trying to portray a negative situation into a much higher and a much positive highlight. Anyways, but the matter has to be seen in a wider context. While there was a wide increase in wealth and rise in real wages in Europe during the period, there was overall stagnation, if not decline, of living standards in India under the British rule. So, what I was saying is now somewhat clarified in the next paragraph, in the next lines. So, I would like to read it again. But the matter has to be seen in a wider context. While there was a vast increase in wealth and rise in real wages in Europe, there was an overall stagnation, if not decline, of living standards under the British rule. But this is a matter which will be studied in greater detail in the volume of Modern India. The ruling class, the nobles, and zamindars. The nobility, along with the landed gentry, the zamindars, formed what may be called the ruling class in medieval India. Socially and economically, the Mughal nobility formed a privileged class. Theoretically, the doors of Mughal nobility were open to everyone. In practice, persons belonging to aristocratic families, whatever they were, Indians or foreigners, had a decided advantage. So the aristocratic families, uh, the Indians and foreigners, they had a much more edge to get into this nobility, into the noble classes. To begin with, the bulk of the Mughal nobles were drawn from the homeland of Mughals, Turan, and from its neighboring areas, Tajikistan, Khorasan, Iran, etc. Although Babur was a Turk, Mughal rulers were Mughal rulers never followed a narrow racialist policy. Babur tried to win the leading Afghan nobles to his side, but they proved to be restless and untrustworthy and soon defected. The tussle between the Mughals and the Afghans continued in Bihar and Bengal even under Akbar, but from the time of Jahangir, Afghans also began to be recruited in the nobility. Indian Muslims, who were called Sheikhzadas or Hindustanis, were also given service. So Indian Muslims were called the Sheikhzadas or Hindustanis. From the time of Akbar, Hindus also began to be recruited into the nobility on a regular basis. So we have studied the matrimonial alliances of Akbar, and in that he offered a greater noble positions to the father and brother of his Hindu wife. The largest section among them was that of Rajputs. Among the Rajputs, also the Kachwahas predominated. According to a modern calculation, the proportion of Hindus in the nobility under Akbar in 1594 was about 16% only. But these figures do not give an adequate idea of the position and influence of the Hindus. So the proportion of the Hindus in nobility during Akbar's time was just 16%. So it might turn out to be a very uh, minority kind of position. But in terms of the influence or in terms of the domination they had, like Raja Man Singh, Birbal, and some other people who held a much greater dominance or influence over Akbar's noble classes, this would have been this should also have been accounted for. Both Raja Man Singh and Raja Birbal were the personal friends and boon companions of Akbar, while in the sphere of revenue administration, Raja Todarman had a place of great influence and honor. The Rajputs who were recruited to the nobility were either hereditary Rajas or belonged to the aristocratic families related to or allied to the Raja. Thus, the incorporation into the nobility strengthened its aristocratic character. Despite this, the nobility did provide an avenue of promotion and distinction to many persons of humble origin. The nobility attained a considerable measure of stability under Jahangir and Shah Jahan. Both these monarchs paid careful attention to the organization of the nobility, the Mansabdari system, orderly promotions, discipline, and the recruitment of competent people into the imperial service. The Mughal nobles, as we have seen, received salaries which were extremely high by any standards. This, as well as the liberal policy of the Mughal emperors, in the matters of faith and stable political conditions in India attracted many talented persons from foreign lands to the Mughal court. Thus, there was a brain drain in reverse. So nowadays there's a brain drain from India to the other parts of the uh, world. But at that time there was a brain drain in reverse. Like people from different parts of the world were coming to India in order to gain a much higher position and more revenues and salaries. Okay. On the account of the influx into India of Iranis, Turanis, and many others such of service at the Mughal court, a French traveler, Bernier, has stated that the Mughal nobility consisted of foreigners who entice each other to the court. Modern research has shown the statement to be fallacious. Okay. Well, talented people continued to come to India, and many of them rose to prominence in the service of the Mughals. All of them settled down in India and made it their permanent home. So, unlike the Britishers who were trying to who were trying to exploit India by the economic drain, because they were trying to accumulate the Indian wealth and transfer it all to the European lands, most of them. But here, the foreigners would come and they would work in the Mughal court, or they would serve in India, and then they would settle in and make this as their homeland, in spite of returning back. Thus, during medieval times and at earlier times, India continued to provide a home to many people who came from outside. But these immigrants are rapidly assimilated into the Indian society and culture. So they were mixed, but at the same time retaining some of their special traits. This accounts for the richness and diversity which has been a special feature of Indian culture. So the richness and diversity of the Indian culture can be attributed to the fact that there have been many foreigners who would come to India for different purposes, and eventually they would settle in India. This would lead to a mixing of certain traits and certain features. Although they retained some of their special features, but there was an intermingling of different customs, different cultures, and thereby was formed and consolidated the Indian culture, a different, which was a mix of different societies, different cultures all together. Under Jahangir and Shah Jahan, the bulk of the nobles already consisted of those who had been born in India. Simultaneously, the proportions of Afghans, Indian Muslims, and Hindus in the nobility continued to rise. A new section among the Hindus which entered the nobility during the period consisted of Marathas. Jahangir was the first monarch who realized that the Marathas were the hub of affairs in the Deccan and tried to win them over to his side. The policy was continued by Shah Jahan. Among the Maratha Sardars who served Shah Jahan was Shahji, the father of Shivaji, though he soon defected. Aurangzeb also gave service to many Marathas and Deccani Muslims. We shall discuss Mughal relations with the Marathas in a later section. However, it may be noted that while the Hindus formed roughly 24% of the nobility during the Shah Jahan, they accounted for about 33% of the nobles during the second half of Aurangzeb's reign, while their total number doubled. So the proportion of Hindus in the nobility was kind of increasing. Like it was 16% in Akbar's reign, then it went to 24% during the reign of Shah Jahan, and then 33% during the reign of Aurangzeb. But there were also like different views regarding Aurangzeb's rule and his treatment towards the Hindus. Of the Hindu nobles, the Marathas formed more than half. Although the Mughal nobles received extremely high salaries, their expenses were also very high. Each noble maintained a large train of servants and attendants and a large stable of horses, elephants, etc., and transport of all types. Many of them maintained a large harem of women, which was considered normal for a man of status in those times. I would like, what was the plight of women at that time? You could not even imagine. The nobles it's the noble aided the Mughal emperors in leading a very ostentatious life. They lived in fine houses containing gardens with fruit trees and running water. They wore the finest clothes and spent a lot on their table expenses. According to an account, 40 dishes used to be prepared for each meal for Akbar. A lot of money was spent on fruits, the choicest being imported from Samarkand and Bukhara. Ice, which was an item of luxury, okay, ice was an item of luxury, was used the year round by the privileged classes. Jewels and ornaments, which were worn both by men and women, was another costly item. Jahangir introduced the fashion of men wearing costly jewels in their ears after piercing them. So the studs was introduced by Jahangir. To some extent, jewelry was also meant to be a reserve to be used in an emergency. Another item of expenditure was presents to the emperors, which had to be made twice a year. However, it should be remembered that the value of presents to be given was fixed according to status of the individual. Also, the nobles received presents from the emperor in return. It has been argued that the Mughal nobles had little interest in saving because after their em- it has been argued that the Mughal nobles had little interest in saving because after their death, all their properties reverted to the emperor because in theory everything flowed from him. So they didn't save, and eventually after their death, everything would return back to the ruler because everything was given by him. But this is not true. The Mughal emperors did not claim the property of the nobles. However, when a noble died, a careful inventory of his property and estate was made because generally the noble owed considerable sums of money to the central treasury. These debts had to be adjusted before the property could be handed over to his heirs. Secondly, the emperor reserved the right of distributing the property of a noble between his surviving sons according to his choice and not on the basis as laid by the Islamic law. So, the inheritance of the noble's property was not according to the Islamic law, rather, it was according to the wish of the emperor who he would find as the right fit. Among other things, it means that daughters did not receive a share of their father's properties. The procedure sometimes led to considerable delays and harassment of the dependents of the deceased noble. Aurangzeb made a rule that the properties of a noble who did not owe money to the state were not to be attached, and that in any case, a certain part of the property of a deceased noble should be made available immediately to his dependents. Nevertheless, spending, not hoarding, was the dominant characteristic of the ruling class of the time. So, as we've seen, one class was unable to meet the bare subsistence of livelihood, the peasants, artisans, and now there are people of the noble classes who would like to spend rather than hoard their, uh, rather than save their properties because they knew that eventually it would all go back to the emperor. So they would just make merry and spend all of it. So there's a huge disparity. You can see the huge inequality between the two sections of people. And obviously, sometimes it was because of the added advantage the noble classes or the aristocratic classes would get because of their lineage. Sometimes it would, but there was also an option for the humble people to join the noble classes. So it depends on various variables. Although we do hear of a few nobles who left large sums in cash and jewelry at the time of their death, most of the nobles were deeply in debt due to the extravagant style of their living. One reason for this was that there was no adequate outlets for profitable investments. There was no stock market, obviously, and they could not invest in real estate because even though they invested, it would eventually go to the emperor, as we've seen earlier. Anyways, in a remarkable passage, Abu Fazl advises the nobles to invest a little in commercial speculation and engage in remunerative undertakings. These include sale and purchase of goods. Abu Fazl also invited the nobles to invest money on interest. From the remarks of the contemporary European travelers, it appears that many nobles took an interest in trade and commerce. The English factor at Surat remarked in 1614 that large and small large and small are merchants. Members of the royal family, including princes and queen mothers, took keen interest in foreign trade. Akbar's widow, the mother of Jahangir, owned ships which plied between Surat and Red Sea ports. Mir Jumla, a leading nobleman during the reign of Aurangzeb, owned a fleet of ships which carried on extensive commerce with Persia, Arabia, and countries of Southeast Asia. Even the chief Qazi of Aurangzeb had commercial undertakings which he tried to conceal from the emperor. Thus, individual nobles were not at all averse to taking part in trade and often led to misuse their positions to earn additional money for their expenses. However, the role of nobility as a class in promoting and expanding commerce is uncertain. Generally speaking, income from land rather than commerce remained the chief occupation concern of the nobles. The merchants had more to fear from them than to expect their favors. The pattern of living of the nobles was aided by other classes in society to the extent possible. This led to a demand for all kinds of luxury goods or goods of superior quality and workmanship. Although both the emperor and the nobles were fond of rarities from different countries or toys as they were called by the European traders, the bulk of their requirement was produced within the country. So there was no drain of wealth, there was no such luxury goods which were imported and sold in India for the noble classes. That is why, as Babar has observed, artisans of every kind were to be found in abundance in India. So this could be also be attributed to the fact that there were many aristocratic or many noble royal families which would patronize the artisans or the artisans like the painters, the workmen of a superior quality in their courts, and these were the people who were mostly affected by the British policies, and thus they formed the backbone of the British revolt, of the revolt against the British. Some of the nobles purchased lands which were converted into markets or orchards. The introduction of new varieties of fruits in India and their popularization must be considered one of the achievements of the Mughal emperors and the nobility. New varieties of fruits, because we have seen that in the earlier pages that the Mughals were fond of food and fruit items because have been instances where they would import the choice of fruits from Samarkand and Khorasan. It was Samarkand and Khorasan, right? Sorry, it was Samarkand and Bukhara. So the introduction of new varieties of fruits in India and the popularization must be considered one of the achievements of Mughal emperors and the nobility. The nobles also provide patronage to artists of various types. Many of them maintained musicians in their households. Patronage was also given to painters, poets, and scholars. Thus, a cultural climate was generated. Patronage and support were extended to artisans who could produce works of superior quality. A rapid growth in the number of nobility during the 17th century, tensions between different groups, individuals, and sections, and a crisis in the working of the Jagirdari system had a serious effect on the discipline and proper functioning of the nobility under Aurangzeb and during the reign of his successors. Some of these aspects are dealt in a greater detail in a subsequent chapter. Zamindars from the writings of Abu Fazl and other contemporary authors. It is clear that personal ownership of land was very old in India. The right of ownership in land depended mainly on succession, but new rights of ownership in land were being created all the time. The tradition was that anyone who first brought land under cultivation was considered its owner. So anybody who first brought land under cultivation was considered its owner. There was plenty of cultivable wasteland Banjar available in medieval times. It was not difficult for an enterprising group of people to settle a new village or to bring under cultivation the wastelands belonging to a village and become the owner of these lands. So, if somebody had to become the owner of the land, he would have to first bring that land under cultivation. So, it was a very common phenomenon of people who would want to settle a new village that they would have to bring the cultivation, like they had to bring the wastelands nearby into cultivation and become the owner of these lands. In addition to owning the land they cultivated, a considerable section of the zamindars had the hereditary right of collecting land revenue from a number of villages. This was called his taluka or his zamindari. So they also had the right of collecting land revenue from different villages, and it was a hereditary right. For collecting the land revenue, the zamindar received a share of the land revenue, which go up to 25% in some areas. Zamindar was not the owner of all the lands comprising the zamindari. He was not the owner, he was the collector. The peasants who actually cultivated the land could not be dispossessed as long as they paid the land revenue. So the zamindars and the peasants had their own hereditary rights in the land. So the hereditary, if we come into the aspects of the hereditary rights, so zamindars had the hereditary rights of collection of the land revenue from different villages. However, the peasants also had the hereditary right of cultivation in their own lands, and they could not be dispossessed from their land unless there was a short of um revenue payment, land revenue payment. Above the zamindars were the rajas who dominated larger or smaller tracts and enjoyed varied degrees of internal autonomy. These rajas are also called zamindars by the Persian writers to emphasize their subordinate status. But their position was superior to that of the zamindars who collected the land revenue. Thus, medieval society, including rural society, was highly segmented or hierarchical. Zamindars had their own armed forces and generally lived in forts or gadhis, which was both a place of refuge and a status symbol. The combined forces of the zamindars were considerable. According to P. in Akbar's reign, they had 384,558 sawars and foot soldiers, elephants, and cannons. But the zamindars were dispersed and could never field such large forces anytime at one place. The figures perhaps also include the strength of the subordinate rajas. Zamindars generally had close connections on a caste, clan, or tribal basis with the peasants settled in the zamindaris. They had considerable local information about the productivity of land. The zamindars formed a very numerous and powerful class which was to be found all over the country under different names such as Deshmukh, Patil, Naik, etc. Thus, it was not easy for any central authority to ignore or eliminate them. It is difficult to say anything about the living standards of the zamindars compared to the noble class. Compared to the nobles, their incomes was limited. The smaller ones may have lived more or less like the peasants. However, the living standards of the larger zamindars might have approached those of petty rajas or nobles. Most of the zamindars apparently lived in countryside and from the kind of loose, dispersed local gentry. In addition to the zamindars, there was a large class of religious driven divines and learned men who, in return of the services, were granted tracts of lands for their maintenance. Such grants were called milk or Madad Mash in Mughal terminology and Shasan in Rajasthan. Although these grants were to be renewed by every ruler, they often they often became hereditary in practice. Many of the grantees held official positions such as that of Qazi, etc. Hence, they had both a rural and an urban base. Writers, historians, hakims, etc. were also often drawn from this section. We have little idea again of the living standards of this section. In course of time, some of them began to be regarded a part of the rural gentry. It is possible that along with the rich peasants, this local gentry provided a limited market for products of the city and also for the products of the superior type of rural artisans. Trade and commerce, the middle classes, nature and standard of living. The middle classes in medieval India consisted in the main of merchants, professional classes such as vergers and hakims, and officials. We have already referred to the standards of living of some of the professional classes. The professional and official classes were numerous in medieval India. There was high degree of professionalism among the Indian merchants. Some specialized in wholesale trade and others in retail trade, the former being called Seth or Bohra, and the later Vyoparis or Banik. So the ones who specialized in wholesale trade, they were called Seth or Bohra. And the ones who specialized in retail trade, they were called Vyaparis or Baniks. In South India, the Chetis, I guess these are the ones who are now called Chetis, formed the trading community. There was a special class, Banjaras, who specialized in carrying trade. The Banjaras used to move from place to place, sometimes with thousands of oxen laden with food grains, salt, ghee, etc. The Sarafs specialized in changing money, keeping money in deposit, or lending it or transmitting it from one part of the country to the other by means of hundi. So the Sarafs specialized in the transaction of money by the means of hundi. The hundi was a letter of credit payable after a certain period. Hundi was a letter of credit payable after a certain period. The use of hundis made it easier to move goods or to transmit money from one part of the country to the other, to another. The hundis were cashed at a discount, which sometimes included insurance so that the cost of goods lost or destroyed in transit could be recovered. So these hundis were cashed at discounted rates because it sometimes included insurance so that the cost of goods which were lost or destroyed in transit could be recovered. So the Sarafs were the one who were managing the money, the monetary transactions, and they used to do it in terms of hundis. Hundis are the credit notes, which were often uh, cashed at a discounted rates. The hundis were the letter of credit, which were payable after a certain period of time. By these means, the Indian merchants could easily ship goods to countries of West Asia as well as where there were Indian banking houses. English and Dutch traders who came to Gujarat during the 17th century found the Indian financial system to be highly developed and Indian merchants to be active and alert. There was keen competition for inside information, and whenever there was a shortage of some goods in some part of the country, it was made good quickly by the merchants. But this applied to goods of high quality. Food grains and bulk articles were costly to move overland, but not so costly if moved by rivers. Hence, the major rivers carried much more goods in medieval times than now. However, the total trade was limited since the villages which since the villages was limited since the villages, while not completely self-sufficient, bought only a limited number of things from outside such as salt, iron, and a few consumer goods. Long distance trade generally catered to the needs of the affluent sections in the city. The trading community in India was fairly large in number and included some of the richest merchants in the world. The names of Virji Vora, who dominated in Surat for several decades and who had a large fleet of ships, Malaya Chetty on the Coromandel coast, and Abdul Ghaffur Bohra, who left 85 lakhs of rupees in cash and goods at the time of his death in 1718, are some of the noteworthy cases. There were many wealthy merchants in Agra, Delhi, Balasore, and Bengal also. The wealthy merchants in the coastal ports of Gujarat lived in an ostentatious manner and aped the manners of the nobles. They lived in lofty houses with colored tiles, wore fine clothes, rode well caparisoned horses, and had people carrying flags and banners before them when they moved out in public. European travelers mention the commodious and well built houses in which the wealthy merchants of Agra lived, but ordinary sorts lived in houses above their shops. The French traveler Bernier says that the merchants tried to look poor because they were afraid that they would be used like filled sponges that is squeezed off their wealth. This appears to be wrong because the emperors from the time of Sher Shah passed many laws for protecting the property of the merchants. The laws of Sher Shah are well known. Jahangir's ordinances included a provision that if anyone, whether unbeliever or a Mussulman, should die, his property and effects should be if left to for his heirs, and no one should interfere with them. If he should have no heirs, they should appoint inspectors and separate guardians to guard property so that its value might be expended in a lawful expenditure, such as the buildings of mosques and sarais, repairs of broken bridges, and the digging of tanks and wells. So, if the deceased had no heirs, then inspectors and separate guardians will be appointed and they would guard the property, and the value might be expended in some lawful expenditure like the repairing of the mosque and sarais or the broken bridges and the digging of tanks and wells, etc. Thus, the concept of protection of private property, including the property of merchants, has had clearly emerged. Nevertheless, the force of habit and insecurity in the cities where thefts were common made many merchants live like ordinary people or in a miserly manner. So they had to underplay their wealth or underplay their status because the thefts were mostly common in that time. Organization of trade and commerce, role of European trading companies. Trade and commerce expanded in India during the first half of the 17th century due to a number of factors. Perhaps the most important factor was the political integration of the country under Mughal rule and establishment of conditions of law and order over extensive areas. The Mughals paid attention to roads and sarais, which made communication easier. A uniform tax was levied on goods at the point of their entry into the empire. Road cesses or rahdari were declared illegal, though it continued to be collected by some of the local rajas. The Mughals minted silver rupees of high purity, which became a standard coin in India and abroad, and thus helped India's trade. Some of the Mughal policies also helped the commercialization of the economy or the growth of money economy. Salaries to the standing army as well as to many of the administrative personnel, but not to the nobles, were paid in cash. Under the Zabti system, the land revenue was assessed and required to be paid in cash. Even when the peasant was given the option of choosing other methods of assessment such as crop sharing, the share of state was generally sold in the villages with the help of grain dealers. It has been estimated that about 20% of the rural produce was marketed, which was a higher proportion. The growth of the rural grain markets led to the rise of small townships or kasbas. The demand for all types of luxury goods by the nobles led to the expansion of handicraft production and to the growth of towns. According to Ralph Fitch, who came to India during Akbar's reign, Agra and Fatehpur Sikri were each larger than London. Montserrat says that Lahore was second to none of the cities in Europe or Asia. Bernier says that Delhi was not much less than Paris and that Agra was larger than Delhi. So this is a very unusual comparison. Ahmedabad was also a large town, being as large as London and its suburbs. Dhaka, Rajmahal, Multan, and Burhanpur were large towns, while Patna in Bihar had a population of 2 lakhs. The growth of towns and town life is one of the significant features of the 17th century. A study of Agra shows that it doubled in area during the 17th century. Another factor which helped India's trade was the arrival of Dutch and English traders. Towards the beginning of the 17th century, the Indian traders welcomed these traders, for they helped to break the Portuguese monopoly of the sea trade, and in course of time helped to establish a direct link between Indian and European markets. However, like the Portuguese, the Dutch, and the English traders also desired to establish a monopoly and establish fortified establishments so that they could defy the local rulers. The Mughals therefore watched the activities closely. So there was a monopolistic policy followed by the Portuguese. So the Mughals tried to disregard or tried to dechain it with the use of the Dutch and the English traders. However, the Dutch and English traders also had the same intentions, and they would uh, go to certain levels in order to defy the local rulers, and they wanted to establish the fortified establishments to guard their properties. So all of them had the same intentions. So Mughals also knew it, and they paid greater attention to their activities. Also, the Portuguese power had begun to decline during the second half of the 16th century, as was demonstrated by the defeat of the Spanish Armada by England in 1588. The union of Portugal with Spain, which involved it in Spain's European rivalries and a declining population of Portugal, also hastened its decline. Also, unlike the Portuguese, the Dutch and the English were organized on commercial lines, though the merchants were influential enough to get the military backing of their governments whenever necessary. Despite vehement Portuguese opposition, the Dutch established themselves at Sulipatam, obtaining a firman from the ruler of Golconda in 1606. They also established themselves in the Spice Islands, Java and Sumatra, so that by 1610 they predominated in the spice trade. The Dutch had originally come to the coast for the sake of spice trade, but they quickly realized that spices could be obtained most easily against Indian textiles. The clothes produced on the Coromandel coast was most acceptable and also cheapest to carry. Hence, they spread south from Masulipatam to the Coromandel coast, obtaining pulicat from the local ruler and making it a base of their operations. So the Dutch initially obtained a firman from the ruler of Golconda and established themselves at Masulipatam, and then thereafter in 1610 and thereafter in 1610 into the Spice Islands of Java and Sumatra. So they originally came to the coast for the sake of the spice trade, but they eventually found that the Indian textiles were of much greater value and it was cheaper to carry, so they went south towards the Coromandel coast and then obtained Pulicat from the local rulers and made it as their base of operations. Like the Dutch, English also had come to the coast for the spice trade, but the hostility of the Dutch, who had more resources and had already established themselves in the Spice Islands, forced the English to concentrate on India. After defeating a Portuguese fleet outside Surat, they were able at last to set up a factory in 1612. This was confirmed in 1618 by a firman from Jahangir obtained with the help of Sir Thomas Roe. The Dutch followed and soon established a factory in Surat. The English quickly realized the importance of Gujarat, the center for India's export trade and textiles. In fact, export of textiles was the base of India's foreign trade. As an English writer observed, from Aden to Achin in Malaya, from head to foot, everyone was clothed in Indian textiles. This statement may be somewhat exaggerated, but it was essentially true. The English tried to break into India's trade with the Red Sea and Persian Gulf ports. In 1622, with the help of the Persian forces, they captured Ormuz, the Portuguese base at the head of the Persian Gulf. Thus, by the first quarter of the 17th century, both the Dutch and the English were well set in the Indian trade, and the Portuguese monopoly was broken forever. So the Dutch and English was well set in Indian trade, and the Portuguese monopoly was broken forever. The Portuguese remained at Goa and also at Daman and Diu, but their share in India's overseas trade declined continuously and was insignificant by the end of the century. Apart from sharing in the Asian trade, the English searched for articles which could be exported from India to Europe. At first, the prime trade was indigo, which was used to color the woolens. The indigo found most suitable was that produced at Sarkhej in Gujarat and Vayana near Agra. Soon the English developed the export of Indian textiles called calicoes, calicoes to Europe. At first, the produce of Gujarat was sufficient for the purpose. As the demand grew, the English sought the coat cloth produced in Agra and its neighborhood. Even this was not enough. Hence, the Coromandel was developed as an alternate source of supply. By the 1640, export of cloth from Coromandel equaled that from Gujarat, and by 1660, it was three times that from Gujarat, Masulipatam, and Fort Saint David, which later developed into Madras, were the chief centers of this trade. Gujarat, Masulipatam, and Madras. These were the chief centers of the foreign trade of textiles. The Dutch joined the English in their new ventures, exporting both calico and indigo from the Coromandel coast. The English also explored Lahiri Bandar at the mouth of the river Indus, which could draw the produce of Multan and Lahore by transporting goods down the river Indus, but the trade there remained subsidiary to the Gujarat trade. More important were their efforts to develop the trade of Bengal and Orissa. The activities of the Portuguese and Mark pirates made the development slow. However, by 1650, the English had set themselves up at Hooghly and at Balasore in Orissa, exporting from there raw silk and sugar in addition to the textiles. Another item which was developed Another item which was developed was the export of saltpeter, which supplemented the European sources for gunpowder, and which was also used as a ballast for ships going to Europe. So they first came for the spice trade, then they went for the textiles. After that, they went for calicos, indigo, and now they were going for raw silk and sugar from Balasore and saltpeter, which was an alternative to gunpowder, which was a supplement to the gunpowder and can also be used as ballast for ships going to Europe. The best quality of saltpeter was found in Bihar. Exports from eastern areas grew rapidly and were equal in value to the exports from the Coromandel by the end of the century. Thus, the English and Dutch companies opened up new markets and articles of export for India. Indian textiles became a rage in England by the last quarter of the 17th century. As an English observer wrote, almost everything that used to be made of wool or silk relating either to the dress of women or to the furniture of houses was supplied by Indian trade. As a result of the agitations in 1701, all calicoes painted, dyed, printed, or stained from Persia, China, or East Indies, that is India, were banned. But these and other laws imposing several severe penalties had little effect. In place of printed clothes, the export of white Indian calicos jumped from 21 lakh pieces to 91 lakh pieces in 1701 and to 20 lakhs in 1719. It was 2.5 lakhs to 9.5 lakhs and then to 20 lakhs. It is difficult to compute the total quantum of additional trade generated by the European companies. Moreland, who made a detailed study, says that the direct benefits accruing to India from the new exports was confined to relatively small areas, but in those areas it was substantial. The production of cash crops and increased production of textiles and other commodities further strengthened the trend towards the growth of a money economy. India was more closely linked to the world markets, especially to the European markets, where a commercial revolution was taking place, but this linkage had negative factors as well. Europe had little to supply to India in return for its goods. It was therefore forced to export gold and silver to India to buy the goods it wanted. While the increasing supply of gold and silver helped in commercial expansion, While the increasing supply of gold and silver helped in commercial expansion, it led to a rapid rise in prices, which roughly doubled during the first half of the 17th century. There was a deficit from Europe because Europe didn't had many commodities which it could export back to India, although it was receiving a major chunk of products from India. So it had to eventually export gold and silver. We could see that it was therefore forced to export gold and silver to India to buy the goods it wanted. While the increasing supply of gold and silver helped in commercial expansion, it led to a rapid rise in prices, which roughly doubled during the first half of the 17th century. As usual, inflation hit the poor hardest. This inflation could be attributed to the fact that there was an increasing supply of gold and silver. As the supply increased, the demand increased, and the prices rose. And because of this rise in prices, there was the condition of inflation, and this hit the poor the hardest. Secondly, the Europeans searched for alternatives to their exports of gold and silver to India. They thought of many methods, but the one which appealed to them the most was the acquisition of territories or empire in India, whose revenues could pay for their imports. So they actually eyed on the Indian territory in order to pay for their exports. And this was the real economic drain. They could not succeed in India as long as the Mughal Empire was strong, but it was not long in coming as soon as the weakness of the empire became manifest. So with this, I would like to uh, pause for a while, and I'll see you guys in the next part of the reading of this chapter. It's a long chapter and just one more part, and we would be done with it. So, thank you and bye.